I recently did a video on imposter syndrome, which is that feeling of inadequacy that people sometimes feel related to their rank in jiu-jitsu. You're wearing a blue belt, but you don't feel like you're representing that belt particularly well, and therefore you feel like an imposter. Well, that feeling of imposter syndrome isn't just reserved for students of jiu-jitsu. Instructors, coaches, school owners sometimes feel imposter syndrome as well. And I was reminded of that fact because I got a message the other day from a friend of mine who's a black belt, a school owner. In fact, he's a great black belt. He is very, very skilled, and he's a great athlete as well. I have immense respect for this guy, but he's getting deeper into his 50s now, and he's just not as decisively dominant in a way that he used to be, and he's starting to feel that imposter syndrome. Let me read the message. I'm sure you've had your share of younger, stronger, faster when it comes to students or just plain roles. Over the last few years of rolling with these individuals, I'm finding I simply don't match up with them physically any longer. Understanding that I attempt to switch to a more technical game, however, what's odd is how often I feel technically less adequate as well. Okay, let's talk about it. Before we begin, I just want to mention that Old Grappler Summit is almost sold out, which blows my mind because I just announced it like 5 weeks ago and there are not that many spots left. So if you think you might be interested in joining us, what is Old Grappler Summit? It's a 3-day training event for the over 40 crowd down here in San Diego, California that I run. The next one is this coming April. And we still have an early bird discount in effect, but we don't have that many spots left. So if you want to get more information on that, just go to my website, rickellis.com, and hit the events tab, or hit my LINKTREE. If you're curious about all the various things that I'm involved in, all the stuff that we do on the Art of Skill platform and my social media and everything, you can find me at LINKTREE. I'm Rick Ellis at LINKTREE, and I'll put that info on the screen as well. What jumped out at me from my friend's message was his feeling of being technically inadequate, when in reality, he is incredibly technical in jiu-jitsu, but we need a body in order to execute the techniques of jiu-jitsu. Everybody in jiu-jitsu preaches technique over strength, that you shouldn't use strength inefficiently, and that you should conserve your strength, and all the mantras that we hear. But make no mistake, we need a body in order to execute jiu-jitsu. And if you have a body that is not optimized to execute perfectly, then you're not going to have perfect execution. It's like handing an excellent race car driver a mediocre car and that person expecting that they're going to have an excellent result when they have a car and a chassis and an engine that isn't giving them the performance they need. And you see it in sports in general. You see athletes that are at the top of their game, and within 1 or 2 seasons, all of a sudden, they're no longer top of their game. In fact, they look kind of mediocre. I remember Anderson Silva looking, that way after having such an amazing run in the UFC. Deep into his 30s, into his 40s, he still looked absolutely amazing. But you lose a few percentage points of capability in terms of physical attributes, and then that's it, especially at the elite levels. When you've got 2 elite athletes, sometimes the difference between great and elite is a couple percentage points of capability. So that's the first thing I would say about that. All of us aging athletes experience that same thing. I experience that every time I spar. I experience the fact that I'm just not as physically capable. I'm a little bit slower. I can't execute as quick as I would like. And you look at the matchups on paper that I have, and I should be able to tool this guy. And yet sometimes we get to the end of the round and I'm still working on that first submission. So this is just something that we have to accept as we get older. It's commonly understood that When technique is roughly the same between two athletes, the better athlete will usually win or certainly have a significant advantage. So if you're bigger, faster, stronger, but your technique is the same as the guy you're going against, you're going to have an advantage. Duh. I mean, that's pretty obvious, which means that in order to be successful against people with better attributes than you have to have significantly more technique. And it's my conviction that that gap in your technique versus your opponent's technique has to get wider and wider and wider as you get older and older. And eventually, even though you may have a massive technical advantage over the person you're going with, it's not enough to overcome the overwhelming physical attributes. And let me throw a little graph on the screen. I kind of plotted this out. And so on the y-axis on the left, you can see something I'm calling technique coefficient. And you might remember from math, a coefficient is just a multiplier. So if you were to invest $1,000 in an investment and you get a 5x return, well, 5 is your coefficient and you just multiply it. And so on the left, you've got the technique coefficient, which is the amount of technique you have to have greater to overcome the attribute gap. And so you can see that as the attribute gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you need increasingly more technique to deal with that. And so this is how I would show it kind of graphically, so you have a mental model of what something like this might look like. But in practice, it just means that you need a lot more technique than the person you're going with in order to decisively be successful when they have better attributes. And there's a point at which you start running into a ceiling there. And I think my friend is starting to experience that with some of the people he goes against, the better, bigger, stronger athletes. And I feel bad for him. I feel bad for anybody that experiences this. I feel bad for myself because I deal with this all the time as well. So if you're a coach, a school owner, an instructor, this is what I would say to you. And look, there are black belt academy instructors in jiu-jitsu that never get on the mat and roll. Okay. And I don't know why. I don't know them all to ask them. But the ones I do know generally say, well, I've got too many injuries. I'm just too beat up from all the years of training. I just can't roll anymore. And that may be true. Or it could be that they're experiencing imposter syndrome, because in jiu-jitsu, there's always this expectation that you need to be the toughest guy in the room. If that's your school, if you're the academy owner, you should be able to deal with anybody that walks through the door. But that's not realistic. And you only see that in jiu-jitsu. You don't see that in other sports. There's no expectation that the college football coach is going to suit up and jump into a scrimmage with his students. There's no expectation that Cus D'Amato was going to jump into the ring and spar with Mike Tyson, or that Phil Jackson was going to jump into some scrimmage drills and see if he could box out Shaq, right? You just don't see that in other sports. But in jiu-jitsu, we feel like we have to represent at our level. And if you're the school owner, you got to be the best guy in the room. And so what I would tell instructors is you need to kind of recalibrate what your role is, because ultimately you're there as a teacher, you're there as a coach, you're there as a motivator, you're there as someone to lean on, you're there as a mentor. You don't have to be the guy that can defeat everybody in the room. It's great if you can, but everybody in jiu-jitsu will at some point be confronted with the fact that they can't do that anymore. Even elite level athletes, at some point, they're just not going to be able to execute in a way that they once could. And so if your ego is so wrapped up in your performance on the mat, then it's going to be a very bitter pill to swallow. It's going to be tough to accept that you're not the person you used to be. Ultimately, I think you just have to accept it and be happy with it, because you can't do anything about it. Yeah, you can continue to work out and continue to get stronger and continue to train. And, I feel like I'm still improving, even though I'm pretty old to be doing jiu-jitsu. Every year I feel like I'm better. Every year I feel like I could defeat the old me from a year ago. But at some point that's not going to be the case anymore. And it's already not the case that my technique is always enough to decisively deal with the physical challenges that I face on the mat. I'm confronted by that every day. And so that's what I would say to coaches and practitioners in general. Imposter syndrome is so common. I've done 2 other videos on this subject, and they always get a lot of feedback, a lot of engagement, because it's a very common thing that people feel. Ultimately, I think it's a positive thing because it always requires some change, some growth, to deal with. If you're a practitioner and you have imposter syndrome, you say, well, I just got to work a little bit harder. I got to get to where I feel like I can really represent this belt. And so there's a built-in motivator there. And if you're a coach, well, it's going to, force you to accept, that your role is one, again, of being a teacher and a mentor, and not necessarily the guy that can show by example every single time. So that's what I have today, and I'm curious to hear from you guys below. If you're instructors, have you dealt with this, and how do you feel about it? And there you go. All right, I look forward to talking to you guys again real soon.